Dive watches aren't new, they've been around for over half a century. We could argue who launched the first dive watch, but I think that would be a massive discussion for another video. Instead, let's focus on the dive bezel itself, understanding the markings that we have, understand how to actually use the dive bezel, and then know how to identify a real dive bezel. I've got a whole cluster of dive watches and real dive watches here, various different bezels, but there are two main types of dive bezel. You have one that counts up and one that counts down. The vast majority of dive bezels count up. They show elapsed time. They show you how long you've been diving for. Countdown bezels, like the one that you find on the Tudor Pelagos FXD, are actually for navigation rather than timing the dive itself. The most common dive bezel is one that you would find like this one on an Omega Seamaster. This is a unidirectional bezel, meaning it can only go in one way. It's ratcheted so it can't go in the other way. This is a safety feature so that you don't accidentally make it so that your watch is displaying your dives shorter than it actually is. This is obviously a safety thing because you might run out of oxygen. Most dive bezels, just like on the Seamaster and the Submariner, and the vast majority of dive bezels, they go up to 60 minutes. That's typically because it's very rare for you to have a dive that will actually last longer than 60 minutes. 60 minutes is actually a long dive. There are, of course, exceptions to these rules. For example, the Blancpain 50 Fathoms Tech Gombassa has a 3-hour dive bezel. That's because this is for people diving with rebreathers. Not all dive bezels are external either. You can get internal dive bezels that are controlled by a crown, just like on the JLC Polaris, but they work in exactly the same way as external dive bezels. So what makes a true dive bezel? For something to be truly a dive watch, it has to meet ISO ratings. The ISO rating for a dive watch is ISO 6425. This states that the watch must have a rotating bezel, which for safety reasons can only be rotated counterclockwise, which can be operated in 30 centimeters of water. Continuous minute markings, and every 5 minutes a clearly legible offset line marking, as well as a luminous triangle mark on the bezel, or depending on the design, on the dial, with which the immersion time is marked. Clear readability of the dive watch from a distance of 25 centimeters in the dark, which is why markings on the bezel, hands indices are provided with a light source, lume. There are many dive watches that don't adhere to all of these specifications laid out by ISO. For example, the Tudor Blancpain ceramic. Let's check out the markings from those ISO standards. So we've got that triangle at the 0 minute marker, and it's illuminated by the pip in the middle of it. And then we have the various markings around the outside, be it long lines or numerals, indicating the 5-minute intervals of the minutes. On the Seamaster, we also have individual minute markers as these dots around the outside throughout the whole duration of the 60-minute bezel. On the Sea-Dweller, we have minute markers throughout the whole bezel, but they're elongated from 0 to 15, and that's very common with dive watches. You can see on the Submariner, we have just 5-minute intervals throughout the whole bezel, but we only have minute intervals up to the 15-minute marker. This is a bit of a heritage thing, because when dive watches were created before the time of dive computers, you would need to use your bezel not just to time the dive itself, but then use the bezel to time the decompression stages. The fact that the dive bezels only go up to 15 minutes of decompression further highlights the fact that this is a heritage mark, because at the time that dive watches and dive bezels were invented, 15 minutes would be pretty much the maximum that you would need to do for a decompression stop. Now divers can go much lower, and so you could have up to a 20-minute decompression stop. Now these have to be very accurate, and they are all dependent on you and the dive itself. For this reason, you would use a dive computer for this. And that's why this is a bit of a heritage mark. So now you know what the markings are and you understand the requirements of the dive bezel. This is how you use a dive bezel. You simply rotate the triangle, the 0 marker, round to your minute hand, and then you start your dive. The minute hand now corresponds with the dive bezel, and as you go through your dive, you can glance down and see how long you've been diving for. Now, many of us aren't divers. I actually use my dive bezel for timing my cooking, timing at how long a takeaway is going to take. Before I did this, I was a corporate presenter, and I used my dive watch to keep track of various sections of my sessions to make sure everything ran on time. And because it was actually with this watch, and because it's an older Submariner, it's got a very quiet bezel. So people wouldn't really know that I was doing this. Unlike that's so loud. Blancpain 50 Fathoms Swatch. What about this one? This is a, yeah, that's pretty loud. That's a Sea-Dweller. What about the Seamaster? Yeah, that's pretty loud. I think Submariner wins for the quietest. Now I just use it as a fidget spinner. Drop me a comment down below and let me know what you use your dive bezel for. Now that divers have very fancy dive computers, what are the real world uses of a dive bezel now? It might surprise you that divers still use dive watches. No, I don't go diving myself, I'd love to. But I do know a good few divers, and yes, they dive with dive computers, but on the other hand, they also have a dive watch, an analog mechanical dive watch. They explain that the dive computer can do everything and it's very fancy and it displays everything. Because it displays everything, it's actually easier, their words not mine, to glance at the other wrist down at that dive watch and see how long you've been diving for, rather than looking at a computer screen displaying lots of figures. Kind of makes sense. And I also think it's cool that people are still diving with mechanical watches. If you go diving, it is far safer for you to wear a strap than for you to wear a bracelet. All it takes is for a spring bar to fail, and then this loop no longer exists. You've lost your watch. Whereas with the strap, you could have a spring bar fail, and even if the spring bar fails, the loop still exists. Anyway, jump over to barkandjack.com and check out the straps that we have over there. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button. If you like the style of this video, then hit the subscribe button down there and that little bell icon to get notifications when I drop a new video. If you're on Instagram, give me a follow at barkandjack, and I'll see you guys very soon. Take care.